The Duke of Ashford had attended 47 society balls and been bored at every single one. Until the night a mysterious veiled woman walked into the room and the entire ballroom fell silent. Within minutes, the coldest man in London asked her to dance. Twice. Then he asked her to marry him. But the woman he chose wasn't there for love. If you love high-stakes historical romance, subscribe and turn on notifications for more romantic stories every single week. And if you're watching right now, comment below where you're watching from. The Midsummer Ball at Ashford Manor was, by every measure that mattered to London society, the event of the year. Chandeliers dripped with candlelight above heads adorned in feathers and jewels. Every eligible daughter of every titled family in England had been laced into her finest gown tonight for one singular purpose: to be noticed by Edmund Voss, the Duke of Ashford. Not because he was looking for a wife. He never looked for a wife. That was precisely why every mother in the room was certain tonight would be the night he finally chose one. Edmund stood at the top of the grand staircase, surveying the ballroom below with the cool detachment of a man reviewing livestock at market. He was tall enough to see over most heads, broad-shouldered enough that other men unconsciously stepped aside when he passed, and handsome in the severe way that made women feel slightly afraid of themselves for noticing. His dark evening coat was immaculate. His expression was not unkind, it was simply absent, as though the spectacle below him was mildly interesting at best, and he had already calculated exactly how long he was required to remain before propriety permitted his exit. The orchestra struck up a new waltz. The crowd shifted, couples drifting toward the floor, and it was in that rippling movement, that parting of bodies like water disturbed by a stone, that Edmund saw her. She was standing in the entrance of the hall. She had not yet come in. She simply stood there, and Edmund could not have explained afterward what precisely made him look. Some instinct, some pull he hadn't felt before. She was dressed in silver, a gown that shimmered like moonlight trapped in fabric, high-necked and modest in cut, extraordinary in effect. Around her head and face she wore a veil, a fine, intricate thing, silver-threaded lace that obscured her features entirely, while somehow making her more present, not less, more deliberate. And then the gasps began. It started at the edges. A sharp intake here, a fan snapping shut there, whispers rushing through the crowd like wind through wheat. Heads turned, then more heads. Then the ripple reached the dance floor, and couples slowed, then stopped, turning toward the hall entrance with undisguised astonishment. Even the orchestra faltered for half a bar before recovering. "Good Lord," Callum, the Duke best friend, murmured. "Who is that?" No one seemed to know. It was that in a room where everyone knew everyone, where names and lineages and scandals were catalogued and cross-referenced before an invitation was ever sent. No one recognized her. The Duchess Dowager, Edmund's mother, appeared at his other shoulder so suddenly he wondered if she'd materialized from the wallpaper. "Edmund," her voice was careful, the voice she used when she was trying not to alarm him toward a position he hadn't chosen himself. "That young woman has caused quite the—" "I see her." A pause. "Do you know her?" "No." Another pause. "She hasn't been announced." "No," he agreed. He handed his champagne glass to Callum without looking away from the hallway. He descended the staircase. People moved, not because he pushed them, but because they always moved for Edmund Voss, reflexively, the way water redirects around stone. The crowd parted, and he walked through it, past the staring faces and the frantic whispering and the dropped fans, and he crossed the ballroom floor and stepped into the hall. She was still there. Still. She was perhaps 5 feet and 4 inches tall. He could not see her face. He could see her hands, ungloved, which was irregular, her fingers loosely clasped in front of her. Her nails were neat. There was ink, the faintest trace of it, on the side of her right index finger. She was not looking at the crowd. She was looking at a portrait on the hall wall, his grandfather, painted in 1763, severe and disapproving in oils. "He had my same flaw," Edmund said. She did not startle, did not turn immediately, as though she had known he was approaching and had chosen her moment to respond. She turned. He still could not see her face through the veil, but her eyes, dark, steady, and utterly unimpressed, found his with an immediacy that made something in his chest pull tight. "And what flaw is that?" she asked. Her voice carried the faint music of a continental accent. French, perhaps, or something close to it. He expected the world to come to him, Edmund said. He rarely went to it. "That sounds less like a flaw," she said, "and more like certainty that the world would comply." It did comply, until it didn't. She looked back at the portrait for a moment. "And you? Does the world comply for you?" He considered lying. It would have been the elegant thing, the charming thing. He was not particularly charming. "Almost always," he said. "I'm beginning to find it tedious." Behind him, he was dimly aware of the ballroom, of 200 people straining to see, of his mother's careful stillness on the staircase, of Callum frozen mid-sip with an expression of pure, fascinated alarm. He did not look back at any of them. "You haven't given your name to the footman," he said. "No," she agreed. "You were not announced." "No. That is irregular." "Yes." There was the ghost of something in her voice. Not quite amusement, not quite challenge. Something that lived in the space between the two. "Are you going to have me removed?" Edmund looked at her for a long moment, at the stillness she wore like armor, at the ink on her finger, at the eyes that hadn't flickered from his with anything resembling nerves since the moment she'd turned. "No," he said. He extended his hand. "Dance with me." She looked at his hand, then back at his face, and in the silence she left before answering, a silence during which he was aware, almost painfully, that he was holding his breath. He realized that he genuinely did not know what she would say. He could not remember the last time he had not known. "Very well," she said quietly. She placed her hand in his. He led her through the doors and into the ballroom, and every single person in it went silent. The orchestra, taking their cue from God knows what instinct, shifted smoothly into a waltz. Edmund placed his hand at her waist and found to some deep wordless satisfaction that she did not waver, did not stiffen, did not perform pleasure at being close to him. She simply was there, present and deliberate and entirely herself. They danced. Later, much later, when the night had thinned and the candles had burned low and Edmund stood in his study with a glass of brandy he hadn't touched, Callum found him staring at the fire. "You danced with her twice," Callum said. "You've never danced with anyone twice. I'm aware. You don't even know her name." "I know enough." Callum set down his own glass. He recognized the tone, the quiet, irrevocable tone, the one that preceded decisions that could not be unmade. "Edmund, what are you thinking?" Edmund looked into the fire for a long moment. "I'm thinking," he said slowly, "that I have attended 47 balls in my adult life, and I have been bored at every single one of them." He paused. "I wasn't bored tonight." Callum stared at him. "You can't be serious." Edmund finally looked up. "Send word to my solicitor in the morning. I intend to find out who she is." He picked up the brandy. "And then I intend to make her my wife." Finding her took Edmund Voss 4 days. For a man who could move governments with a letter, 4 days felt like an eternity. His solicitor, Mr. Fenn, a precise, nervous little man who had served the Ashford Duchy for 20 years without ever once surprising Edmund, came back 3 times with nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. Whoever she was, she had not arrived through the usual channels. No letter of introduction, no sponsoring family, no record at any of the reputable boarding houses or hotels that catered to foreign nobility visiting London for the season. She was found by afternoon. A modest townhouse in Marylebone, leased under the name Lady Vienne Marceau, a French noblewoman of minor title and significant personal reserve. The landlady, when approached discreetly by Fenn's assistant, described her tenant as quiet, punctual with rent, rarely receiving visitors, and possessed of a personal maid who was, and the landlady said this in the particular tone of English landladies confronted with the inexplicable, also very quiet. Edmund read the report. Then he did something his solicitor, his mother, and his secretary all found equally alarming. He went himself. Elizabeth heard the knock at precisely 3 o'clock, and knew, with a certainty she couldn't quite name, that it wasn't the landlady. She had been sitting at the small writing desk by the window, the one she'd chosen specifically because it faced the street and gave her a clean view of arrivals. She had a document open before her father's correspondence, cross-referenced against a list of names she had spent 2 years assembling, and her right hand was ink-stained in the way it always was when she'd been working for hours without stopping. She closed the document, placed it beneath the false bottom of the writing box, smoothed her dress, which was a sensible gray wool, entirely inappropriate for receiving a duke, and went to the door. She opened it. He filled the frame in a way that seemed slightly unfair. No hat, she noticed. He'd left it with his driver, a deliberate informality, and she understood instantly that it was calculated. A man who understood the language of small gestures. That made him more dangerous. "Your Grace," she said. Something shifted in his expression, quick, almost imperceptible. She'd used his title immediately, which told him she'd known who he was before he'd introduced himself, which told him she'd done her research, which made his eyes sharpen with something that was not quite suspicion and not quite pleasure, but lived somewhere in the charged space between them. "Lady Vienne," he said, "I hope I haven't called at an inconvenient hour." "You knew it wouldn't be inconvenient," she said. "You don't strike me as a man who calls at inconvenient hours by accident." A beat. Then, so briefly she might have imagined it, the corner of his mouth moved. "May I come in?" She considered refusing. She had planned, in the abstract, to refuse, to maintain distance, to keep him at the useful remove of formal courtship, to control the geography of their interactions as carefully as she controlled everything else. She had a plan. The plan required patience. The plan required that she not let him into the 12-foot radius of her writing desk, behind which her father's documents were hidden. "Yes," she said, and stepped back. He called 3 more times that week. Each visit was perfectly proper. Her maid, Lisette, present at all times, tea served and barely touched, conversation conducted at the correct social temperature. And yet each visit left Elizabeth sitting at her window afterward in a state she could not entirely diagnose, not discomfort, not pleasure. Something unresolved, like a mathematical equation she couldn't quite close. He was not what she'd expected. She had expected coldness, and he was cold, but it was the coldness of deep water rather than ice. Underneath it, things moved. She caught glimpses, the way he listened, not performatively, not with the half-attention of men who were composing their next sentence while you spoke, but with a complete and slightly unnerving stillness, as though what you were saying was the only thing currently happening in the world. The way he asked questions that were never quite what they appeared to be on the surface, the way he said more in silences than most men said in paragraphs. On his 4th visit, he brought her a book, not flowers, not jewels. A book, a treatise on Roman property law, published 30 years prior, obscure enough that she had never encountered a copy outside her father's private library. She stared at it for a moment before she could compose her face. "An odd gift," she said carefully. "I noticed the ink on your fingers," he said. "The angle suggests you write for long stretches, which suggests habitual work rather than correspondence. The document on your desk during my first visit, though you closed it quickly, appeared to have marginal annotations in 2 different hands." He paused. "It made me curious about what you read." The precision of his observation sent a cold thread through her chest. He had seen more than she'd intended, much more. "You could simply have asked," she said, keeping her voice light. "I'm asking now," he said. "What do you read, Lady Vienne?" She looked at him steadily. "Everything that helps me understand how power works," she said, "and how it fails." He looked back at her for a long moment. "Then we have something in common." The proposal came on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after the ball. He arrived unannounced, which was unprecedented for him. Lisette barely had time to alert Elizabeth before he was in the parlor, standing with his hands clasped behind his back, looking at the watercolor above the mantel as though it had personally offended him. Elizabeth entered. He turned. "I haven't prepared a speech," he said before she could speak. "All right," she said. "I've considered this carefully. I'm 34 years old. I've avoided marriage with great consistency and I think reasonable justification. I find most social performance exhausting, I have no patience for dishonesty, and I have not until recently encountered a person whose company I preferred to my own." He paused. "You are the exception." Elizabeth stood very still. "You are intelligent," he continued, with the directness of a man reading from a surveyor's report. "You are not impressed by the things most people are impressed by. You do not perform warmth you don't feel, which I respect more than I can adequately express. You are keeping secrets from me. I'm aware of this, and I find that I would rather spend the next 40 years learning what they are than spend them in comfortable ignorance with someone else." The room was very quiet. "You do not perform warmth you don't feel." The sentence struck her somewhere unguarded, and she hated it for that. "That's not a romantic proposal," she said. "No," he agreed. "I can attempt romantic if you require it, but I think you'd find it less convincing." Against every instruction she had ever given herself, something inside her chest moved. She pressed it down. She thought of her father, of the letter that had arrived 3 years ago in Edmund Voss's hand, his signature at the bottom of the document that had ended everything. She thought of the list of names in the writing box 6 feet away. She thought of Lord Whitmore, Edmund's closest advisor, the man she was increasingly certain had orchestrated the entire conspiracy, and whose private correspondence she would only ever access from inside Ashford House. She thought of all of this, and she said, yes. Ashford House was larger than she'd prepared for. Not merely in physical dimension, though it was vast, a Mayfair palace of marble corridors and rooms that opened into other rooms in an endless aristocratic recursion, but in the texture of life inside it. She had expected a cold house, a house that matched its master's reputation, all restraint and formality and correct temperature. Instead, she found a staff of 40 who moved with quiet efficiency and evident loyalty. A housekeeper, Mrs. Price, who had worked there since Edmund was 9, and who looked at Elizabeth on their first meeting with an expression of careful assessment that slowly, over the following days, softened into something approaching approval. A cook who left small dishes of warm things outside Elizabeth's study door in the evenings without being asked, apparently because Edmund had mentioned once, only once, that his fiancée worked late. She found a library that consumed an entire east wing, floor to ceiling, organized in a system. She spent 2 days decoding, and then found to be, when she cracked it, elegant. She found a garden that Edmund visited every morning at 6, alone, walking the same path in the same silence, which she discovered by accident when insomnia drove her to the window, and which she watched twice before telling herself firmly that she was not watching. She found his study. It took her 11 days to access it. Edmund was not careless. His papers were organized and routinely locked, and the study itself was kept closed. But she was patient, and she was clever, and she had been planning this for 2 years. She found her moment on a Tuesday afternoon when Edmund was called urgently to Parliament, and Mrs. Price was managing a delivery crisis in the kitchens. The study door was locked. Elizabeth had anticipated that. The writing desk was locked. She had anticipated that too. What she had not anticipated were the contents of the lower left drawer, which she opened with the small pick she'd carried sewn into her hem since the start of all this, and which contained, beneath the expected documents, beneath the estate correspondence and the parliamentary briefs, a folder she recognized, not because she had seen it before, because her father had described it to her 3 years ago in the last letter he ever sent her before the arrest. He had told her about a document, evidence he had assembled against Lord Whitmore's financial schemes, evidence that he had sent to the Duke of Ashford directly, trusting in the Duke's reputation for integrity, believing that if anyone would act on it, the most powerful man in London would. The document was here. Her father's document, his handwriting, his evidence, unopened. The seal had never been broken. Elizabeth stood in Edmund Voss's study with her father's letter in her hands, and the realization moved through her like cold water, slow, total, and devastating. Edmund had never read it. He had never known. He had signed his name to Whitmore's fraudulent paperwork. She had confirmed that, had seen his signature with her own eyes, but he had signed it without knowing. Whitmore had managed it somehow, buried it in routine correspondence, obtained Edmund's name as a formality or a cover. And when her father had tried to warn him, when her father had sent the very document that could have saved himself, it had been intercepted, filed away, hidden in a locked drawer before it ever reached Edmund's eyes. Whitmore had been in this house, had access to this study. The man she had spent 3 years hating, the man whose proposal she had accepted as a weapon, had been as deceived as her father. She stood there for a long time. Then she replaced the document exactly as she'd found it, relocked the drawer, and walked back upstairs to her rooms, where she sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall until Lisette came to dress her for dinner. Dinner that evening was quiet. It usually was. Edmund was not a man who required conversation to fill silences, and she had come to find that restful in ways she hadn't expected. They sat at opposite ends of a table that was too long for two people, which Edmund had acknowledged exactly once with a dry remark about architectural ambition, and never again. Tonight, she watched him. He was reading a brief between courses. She had learned that he did this, that he could not stop working, that his mind did not have an idle setting, and the candlelight threw shadows across his face that made him look older, and somehow, beneath the coldness of his features, very tired. He looked up and found her watching. She did not look away quickly, as she would have done a week ago. "You're staring," he said. "I'm observing," she corrected. "And what are you observing?" She considered. "That you work too hard." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she was learning to read, the one that meant she had said something that surprised him, that had slipped under the careful management of his reactions before he could catch it. "Most people tell me I am too idle," he said. "A duke who attends Parliament and manages his estates is considered, apparently, to be living a life of leisure." "Most people don't watch you," she said. "They watch what you represent." The silence that followed was different from other silences between them, warmer, more dangerous. "Elizabeth," he said, and then stopped. She went still. He'd used her name. Not Lady Vienne, not the careful formal address he maintained with the precision of a man who understood that names were a kind of intimacy. Her name, which she had given him only once in passing, and which he had apparently stored with everything else he noticed. "You had ink on your left hand today," he said, shifting course. "You've been cross-referencing something. You look like you do when you found information you weren't expecting." The precision of it. The absolute, relentless precision of him. "Do I?" she said. Not a question. "What did you find?" She looked at him across the long table, in the candlelight, with her father's unopened letter fresh in her memory, and the name Whitmore burning in her chest like a coal. "Something that changes things," she said quietly. He waited. He was extraordinarily good at waiting. "Not tonight," she said. "I'm not ready to tell you tonight." He studied her for a long moment. Then, with the deliberateness that characterized every movement he made, he folded the brief he'd been reading, set it aside, and gave her his complete attention for the rest of the meal. He didn't push. He didn't press. He simply stayed. Present and unhurried, asking her small questions about nothing important, and somewhere between the soup and the last candle guttering low, Elizabeth understood that she was in a great deal of trouble. Not because her plan was failing, because it was failing in the direction of something she hadn't planned for at all. She found the second piece of evidence on a Friday. Whitmore visited Ashford House regularly. He was Edmund's advisor, had been for a decade, and moved through the house with the comfortable authority of a man who considered himself essential. Elizabeth had been watching him since her first week, cataloging his movements, the rooms he entered, the conversations he steered. He was careful, experienced in the performance of trustworthiness, which is the most dangerous kind of deception, because it comes so naturally it leaves no seams. But everyone had seams. She found his when she attended a small dinner Edmund hosted for 4 of his parliamentary allies, including Whitmore. She sat at the end of the table, performing the role of quiet, decorative fiancée with the focused energy of a woman running 3 calculations simultaneously, watching Whitmore's hands when certain topics arose, watching how he redirected conversation, watching the almost invisible tension in the line of his jaw when the subject of the Sinclair fraud was mentioned in passing by another guest. There. He knew the name. He tried to cover it, moved immediately to redirect, laid a light conversational stepping stone over the moment like a man covering a crack in ice. But Elizabeth had been watching for it, and she saw the fraction of a second tightening before the recovery. She looked down at her plate. Her father's name, spoken casually at a dinner table 3 years later, and Whitmore's body knew it. Across the table, Edmund was listening to Lord Fenwick describe a drainage problem in the East Counties with his full and genuine attention, because that was the kind of man he was, giving the same careful focus to a drainage report as to a political crisis. He hadn't seen Whitmore's reaction. He had been looking the other way. He trusted Whitmore completely, and Whitmore had destroyed her family. That night in her room, Elizabeth sat with her father's photograph, the one she kept at the bottom of her traveling trunk, the only luxury of feeling she'd allowed herself through 2 years of controlled purpose. And she let herself have 30 seconds of grief. Just 30 seconds. Then she put the photograph away. Then she picked up her pen. And then she did something she had never included in any version of her plan. She began to write a letter to Edmund. She didn't finish it. She sat with the pen above the page for a long time, and then she folded the blank sheet and set it aside, and went to bed, and stared at the ceiling, and listened to the house settle around her. Down the hall, she knew he was still awake, still working. He was always still working. She thought, he signed that document and didn't know what he was signing. He received my father's letter and didn't know what was inside it. He trusted a man who used that trust as a weapon, and he has no idea. She thought, he is not who I came here to destroy. And then, quieter, more frightening than any thought she'd had in 3 years. I don't think I want to destroy him at all anymore. She closed her eyes. Neither of them slept much that night. The dinner party was Lord Whitmore's idea. That was the first thing Elizabeth noticed, not the invitation itself, which arrived on a Tuesday in Whitmore's neat, authoritative hand, requesting the honor of Edmund's company and that of his fiancée for an intimate gathering at Whitmore House the following Friday. Not the guest list, which Edmund showed her over breakfast, 12 names she had already memorized from her own research. Not even the timing, which was pointed 3 weeks before the wedding when the formal announcements had been made, and her name, Lady Vienne Marceau, had appeared in the society pages and could not be easily retracted. It was that Whitmore had suggested it at all. In 6 weeks of living inside Ashford House, watching the rhythm of Edmund's professional life, Elizabeth had observed that Whitmore never hosted. He attended, he advised. He positioned himself always in other men's spaces where he could move freely without the vulnerability of ownership, where nothing could be traced back to a room that bore his name. It was the instinct of a man who had spent decades ensuring his fingerprints never appeared on anything that mattered. So why now? Why a dinner in his own house with Edmund's fiancée present for the first time? She turned the invitation over in her hands after Edmund left the breakfast room. 2 possibilities. Either Whitmore had learned something about her investigation, about the documents she'd been quietly and carefully assembling, and this dinner was a controlled environment designed to let him assess the damage, or he had learned something, and this dinner was something worse than assessment. She pressed the paper flat against the table. She needed more time. 2 more weeks, perhaps 3, and she would have everything. The chain of correspondence linking Whitmore to the original fraud, the financial records she'd identified through Edmund's estate papers, showing payments routed through 3 shell accounts, the witness she'd located in Cheapside, a former clerk of Whitmore's who had left his employ suddenly and under duress, and who had agreed, tentatively, to speak. 2 more weeks. She looked at the invitation. She did not have 2 more weeks. She dressed carefully for the dinner. This, too, was a form of preparation. She understood clothing as language, had learned it from her mother, who had understood that a woman's appearance in any room was a statement made before she opened her mouth, and that the statement should always be intentional. She wore deep blue, not silver. Silver was Lady Vienne, the mystery, the veil, and the distance. Blue was something else, something that said, I am here, I am real, look carefully. She, wore the veil. Of course she wore the veil. To arrive without it now would itself be a statement, would signal a change, would invite exactly the scrutiny she needed to delay for 1 more evening. But she wore it differently, looser, as though it mattered less than it had. Lisette noticed. She said nothing, because Lisette never said anything, but her hands paused for a half-second at the pin, and that half-second was a conversation. Edmund was waiting in the entrance hall when she came downstairs. He was in black, as he almost always was, and he looked up when she appeared on the landing in the way he always looked up, completely, as if whatever he'd been thinking about was immediately reclassified as less important. She had never, in all her careful observation of powerful men, encountered one who listened with his entire body the way Edmund did. It was disconcerting. It made her feel visible in ways that her veil could not entirely prevent. "You look," he said, and then paused in the way he paused when he was editing himself. "Prepared." "I always look prepared," she said, coming down the stairs. "Tonight you look prepared for something specific." She met his eyes. "Don't you always?" The corner of his mouth moved. He offered his arm. In the carriage, they sat in companionable silence for a few minutes. They had developed this, a silence that wasn't empty, that had texture and warmth in it, that she found herself looking forward to in ways she'd stopped trying to rationalize. Then Edmund said, without preamble, "Whitmore has been agitated." She kept her hands still in her lap. "Has he?" "For the past 2 weeks. Small things. I wouldn't expect most people to notice." He was looking out the carriage window, his profile clean and sharp in the passing lamplight. "He asked me twice about your family connections in France, both times framed as idle conversation. Neither time was idle. The air in the carriage was very still." "And what did you tell him?" she asked. "That your connections were satisfactory and that I didn't see how they were his concern." He paused. He accepted that. But he looked very briefly like a man who had hoped for a different answer. Elizabeth said nothing. Edmund turned from the window and looked at her directly. "You told me, 3 weeks ago at dinner, that you'd found something that changed things. You said you weren't ready to tell me." "I remember. Are you ready now?" The carriage rolled on. Gas lamps strobed past the window in slow rhythm. Somewhere outside, London went about its indifferent evening business. "After tonight," she said quietly. "I'll tell you everything after tonight." He looked at her for a long moment, not pressing, not suspicious, something more patient and more serious than either. "All right," he said, "after tonight." Whitmore House was full of candlelight and the specific warmth of a man performing ease. He met them in the entrance hall himself, not leaving it to the butler, which was itself a message. "I am attentive to you. I value this. I'm a man of personal warmth." He was 62, silver-haired, built like a man who had once been athletic and had settled comfortably into authority. He shook Edmund's hand with the practiced sincerity of someone who had spent decades making powerful men feel understood. Then he looked at Elizabeth. She had not seen him look at her directly before. At Ashford House, at parliamentary dinners, at the various social events of the past 6 weeks, she had been peripheral, Edmund's quiet, veiled, slightly foreign fiancé, present but not central. Whitmore had acknowledged her with the particular benign inattention men like him extended to women they had categorized as decorative. Tonight his look was different. It was fast, a professional's flicker, controlled and quickly smoothed over, but it was unmistakably the look of a man running a rapid calculation. She watched it happen. Behind his eyes, the assessment, the uncertainty, the decision to smile. "Lady Vienne," he said warmly, taking her hand. "At last, a proper introduction. Edmund has been unconscionably private about you." "He respects my preference for quiet," she said. "I find large audiences exhausting." "And yet you seem remarkably composed for a woman who exhausts easily," he smiled. The smile reached his eyes at exactly the right depth, practiced to the millimeter. "Come, come, the others are in the drawing room." He released her hand. She felt his gaze on her back as they walked in. The dinner was 12 people and 4 courses, and a master class in surface conversation, beneath which Elizabeth ran her real attention like a second, silent meal. She watched Whitmore manage the table, redirecting, flattering, deploying anecdotes with surgical timing. He was, she admitted to herself, extraordinarily gifted. A lesser woman would have found him charming. She sat 4 seats from him, separated by Lord and Lady Fenwick and a parliamentary undersecretary whose name she'd already noted from her research. Edmund was at the far end, engaged by the host's wife on the subject of educational reform, listening with the same complete attention he gave everything. The 3rd course arrived. Whitmore was mid-anecdote, something about a hunting weekend, laughter in the appropriate places. when he glanced down the table and his eyes landed on her hands. She had set down her fork. Her right hand was on the table, and she'd been making a small, habitual movement with her index finger. A thinking gesture, her father used to call it, the one she made when she was working through a problem, tracing invisible letters on whatever surface was beneath her hand. Her father's gesture. She'd inherited it without knowing. Whitmore's anecdote stopped. Not completely. He caught it, recovered in under a second, finished the sentence. The laughter happened. Someone asked a follow-up question, and he answered it. He was professional to the marrow. But his color had changed. And across the table, a woman named Mrs. Alderton, who had known Elizabeth's father socially and who was one of 12 people Elizabeth had prayed would not be on this guest list, turned to her companion and said, in a voice slightly louder than intended, "Forgive me, but that gesture, my late friend Sinclair's daughter used to do exactly." She stopped herself. Too late. The table did not hear it. Edmund did not hear it. He was too far, too engaged. But Whitmore heard it. He was 4 feet from Mrs. Alderton, and his hearing was sharp and his mind was sharper, and Elizabeth watched the exact moment the calculation completed behind his eyes. He looked at her. She looked back. And in that second, that single suspended second across 12 feet of candlelit dinner table, they understood each other completely. He cornered her at the end of the evening. Deliberately, efficiently, she could see him engineering it, the quiet word to his wife that redirected her, the movement that separated Elizabeth from Edmund's side in the hallway shuffle of departing guests. By the time she registered the maneuver, she was in the corridor off the entrance hall, candlelit and empty, and Whitmore had stepped beside her with the pleasant expression of a man sharing a private joke. "A word," he said, very quietly, still smiling. "Between friends." Edmund was 20 feet away, receiving his coat, his back to them, 30 seconds, perhaps less. "Lady Vienne," Whitmore said. "Or perhaps I should say what you mean," she said, low and even. "We have very little time." "We have more or less time than you think, depending entirely on your next decision." The pleasantness had left his eyes now. What was underneath it was cold and careful and very old. "I don't know precisely who you are. Not yet. But I know what I just saw at that table, and I know that gesture, and I know that Sinclair had a daughter who was, by all accounts, extremely clever." "Then you know," she said, "that she had good reason to be here. I know that a clever girl who has come to make trouble would be very wise to reconsider." He took a half step closer, still smiling, for the benefit of anyone who might glance over. "Edmund is not a man who tolerates deception when he learns what you are, and he will learn, with or without my assistance. He will end this engagement without hesitation. Everything you've worked for, gone. And whatever you imagine you've assembled against me," he paused, "I've had 30 years to bury things. I'm quite good at it." "You're warning me," she said. "I'm offering you an exit. Leave London. Lady Vienne returns to France. The engagement is quietly dissolved. Edmund is momentarily disappointed, and then relieved. Everyone moves forward." He smiled wider. "You're young, intelligent. Start again somewhere. Else, let this one go." Edmund had turned. He was looking at them. She watched his eyes move from Whitmore's face to hers and back again, reading the geometry of it, their proximity, the smile on Whitmore's face that wasn't reaching anywhere, the stillness she was holding herself in with every ounce of discipline she possessed. She had perhaps 10 seconds before he crossed the hall. She had, she realized, 2 years of planning in one hand and one completely unplanned feeling in the other. She looked at Whitmore. "No," she said. His smile disappeared. Edmund arrived. He placed himself beside her with the quiet territorial certainty of a man who had noticed something and was not going to be theatrical about it, but was also not going to pretend he hadn't. "Whitmore," he said pleasantly. "Splendid evening." "As always," Whitmore said. "Smooth as marble. Safe travels." In the carriage going home, Edmund said nothing for a long time. Then, "Tell me now." She looked at him inside the dark of the carriage, his face half lit by a passing lamp, and she thought about everything she'd held in order for 2 years, the grief, the planning, the careful management of every word and gesture and feeling. And she thought about Whitmore's voice saying, "Let this one go." And she thought about her father, alive in his study, ink on his hands, trusting that the right person would read his letter. "It's a long story," she said. "We have 40 minutes." She took a breath. "My name is not Vienne Marceau," she said. "My name is Elizabeth Sinclair. My father was Robert Sinclair, a barrister. 3 years ago he was accused of financial fraud and died in prison awaiting trial." She paused. "The man who engineered his destruction was Lord Whitmore, and your name was on the document that condemned him." The carriage moved through the London streets. Edmund did not speak. "I came here to expose Whitmore," she said. "I came here with a plan, a false identity, and 2 years of evidence. I accepted your proposal because being inside Ashford House gave me access to what I needed." She kept her voice steady. She owed him steadiness at least. "That was why I said yes." Still nothing from him. His face in the dark was unreadable. "In your study," she said, "in the lower left drawer of your writing desk, there is a letter. It arrived 3 years ago and was never opened. It's in my father's handwriting. He sent it to you directly because he believed," her voice almost moved on that word, believed, "because he believed you were the one man in London who would act on it." She watched Edmund's hands tighten almost imperceptibly where they rested on his knees. "Whitmore intercepted it," she said. "He filed it away before it reached you. You signed his paperwork without knowing what you were signing. You were deceived as thoroughly as my father was, and I know that now, and I have known it for weeks." She stopped. "And yet you stayed," Edmund said. His voice was very quiet. "Yes? Why?" She looked at him. She had prepared for many versions of this conversation. She had not prepared for the simplicity of that question, or for how completely it dismantled her. "Because I found the letter," she said, "and it changed everything I thought I knew. And then I kept finding other things that changed everything else, about Whitmore, about you." She paused. "About what I wanted." The carriage turned into Mayfair. "The veil," Edmund said after a moment. "Yes. You've been wearing it since the day we met." "Yes." "Take it off," he said. She reached up. Her hands were steady. She was proud of them for that. She unpinned the veil and drew it back and folded it in her lap, and she sat in front of him in the carriage lamplight with her actual face, her real face, the one that belonged to her father's daughter and not to any invented noblewoman from any invented country, and she let him look. He looked for a long time. She did not know what he saw. She knew what she was. Exhausted, determined, ink-stained in her soul, if not currently on her fingers, grief-marked in ways that 3 years had not erased. She knew she was the woman who had walked into his house as a weapon and stayed past the point where the plan had made any sense. "You were at the ball," he said slowly, "to get close to Whitmore." "Yes." "And I singled you out before you'd managed to enter the room." "Yes." Something passed across his face. Not quite amusement, not quite something darker, but in the neighborhood of both. "Inconvenient." "Profoundly," she said. "And the proposal." "I was going to refuse." She paused. "I had a very clear plan to refuse." "What stopped you?" She looked at him. "You said you'd rather spend 40 years learning my secrets than live in comfortable ignorance with someone else." The carriage stopped. They were home. Edmund did not move to open the door. The lamplight came through the window and sat between them, warm and specific. And outside, London went on being London, enormous and indifferent, and inside the carriage it was just the two of them and everything that had been said and everything that hadn't. "The letter in the drawer," he said. "Yes?" "Show me." They went to the study together. Edmund lit the lamps himself, didn't call for a servant, didn't ring the bell, just took the matches from the mantel and lit them one by one in a silence that had changed quality entirely from the silence of their early dinners. This silence was full, heavy with things in process. Elizabeth went to the drawer. She hesitated for 1 second, the only acknowledgement she would allow herself of the fact that she was revealing precisely how and where she had searched his private belongings, and then she opened it, removed the folder, and placed it on the desk. Edmund stared at it. He picked it up, turned it over, looked at the seal, her father's seal, unbroken, exactly as it had arrived. His jaw tightened. Just once. He broke the seal and read. Elizabeth stood across the desk from him and watched him read her father's words, and it was the most vulnerable she had felt in 3 years, because she could not control this, could not manage or plan what his face did, or what conclusions he reached, or whether 30 pages of careful architecture would land the way her father had intended when he'd sat down, trusting and frightened, and tried to put the truth into the hands of someone powerful enough to act on it. Edmund read for a long time. When he finished, he set the letter down on the desk. He placed his hand flat on top of it, very deliberately, as though staking a claim. Then he looked up at her. "This is dated 3 years and 2 months ago," he said. "Yes." Whitmore had access to my correspondence at that time. He was managing my parliamentary affairs while I was dealing with my father's illness. He said it flatly, without inflection, but she heard what was underneath it, the particular horror of a man realizing how long and how completely he has been used. "I know," she said quietly. "He's been in this house for a decade." "I know." Edmund was silent for a moment. Then, "Your father trusted me." He looked down at the letter again. "He trusted me, and I didn't." "You didn't know," she said. "Edmund." It was the first time she'd used his name without the title, and they both heard it. "He buried it before it reached you. My father knew you hadn't received it. Near the end, he said as much. He didn't blame you." "I blame me," he said, quiet and absolute. I should have known what was in my own house, what my own advisor was doing with my name and my correspondence." He looked up. "I should have known, and I didn't. And a man died." The room was very still. Elizabeth thought of all the things she'd rehearsed for this conversation, all the careful, managed things she'd prepared to feel and not feel, say and not say. None of them were available to her now. She was just a woman standing in a lamplit study watching a man reckon honestly with something unbearable, and she was completely unguarded, and it was the most frightening thing that had happened to her since the beginning of all this. "What do you want to do?" she asked. He looked at her across the desk. His hand was still flat on her father's letter. "I want to finish what your father started," he said, "and I want to do it with you. Here is the full story rewritten and condensed to 1,000 words. They worked through the night. Not romantically, not in the way novels described such things, with meaningful glances and hands accidentally touching over shared documents. It was practical and occasionally terse, the way real work is when the stakes are high enough to burn away everything decorative. Edmund pulled 3 years of correspondence with systematic efficiency. Elizabeth laid her own assembled evidence across the long table, 2 years of careful collection, cross-referenced and annotated in the two-handed system he had noticed on her very first day. He looked at her files for a long moment before he touched them. "How long did this take you?" "The research? About 14 months. The planning before that, another 8. He was quiet. "Alone?" "Yes." He looked at her, just briefly, and she saw something she hadn't expected. Not pity, recognition. The look of a person who understood what it was to carry something enormous in complete isolation and keep moving anyway. Then he turned back to the files. "Show me where you started." By 3 in the morning, they had laid it out in full. Whitmore's scheme was elegant in the way long-practiced deception always is, so embedded in routine it had become nearly invisible. Over a decade, he had siphoned funds from 3 estates, routing them through shell accounts using Edmund's signature as a legitimizing stamp on documents Edmund had signed as a matter of course, trusting the mechanism of his own authority to function without his constant supervision. When Elizabeth's father had stumbled onto one of the routing accounts by professional coincidence, Whitmore had moved fast. Constructed a fraudulent paper trail pointing back to the barrister himself, used Edmund's name to give the accusation weight, and buried her father's warning letter before it could reach the one man who might have unraveled everything. It was meticulous, it was monstrous, and it had worked for 3 years because the one variable Whitmore had not planned for was a grieving daughter with her father's legal mind and nothing left to lose. Edmund sat back and looked at the evidence. He stood at my father's funeral. He stopped. She watched him recalibrate every memory against this new information, one of the loneliest things she'd ever watched a person do. "This is not a reflection of your judgment," she said carefully. Whitmore has deceived people far more suspicious than you for 30 years. I should have been more suspicious. Perhaps, but suspicion corrodes everything it touches. She paused. My father trusted people easily too. It was the quality I most admired in him and the one that cost him everything. The answer isn't to stop trusting. The answer is to be in the room when the people you trust are held accountable. They needed 3 things: the original financial records, the testimony of a former clerk named Thomas Avert, who had left Whitmore's employ under duress, and a legal architecture solid enough that Whitmore could not dismantle it before it reached the right hands. Elizabeth went to Avert alone. She understood that a man frightened into silence by power would not be opened by more power arriving at his door. She went on a Wednesday morning in a plain dress with no veil and no title, and when he opened the door, she said simply, "My name is Elizabeth Sinclair. My father was Robert Sinclair." They talked for 2 hours. At some point in the second hour, Avert sat at his kitchen table with his hands wrapped around a cold cup and said, "He came to me, your father, a week before the arrest. He'd found something in the accounts and I was already afraid. Whitmore had made clear what would happen if I talked, and I had my wife and the girls and the debt, and I told him I didn't know what he was referring to." He looked up. He thanked me. Very polite. I've thought about that every day for 3 years. "The debt is resolved," Elizabeth said, "as of Monday. Unconditionally." He stared at her. Then quietly, "What do you need me to say?" It took 11 days. Edmund moved with the deliberate efficiency of a man who had spent his life learning how institutions worked and had now turned that knowledge entirely against one of them. Whitmore was arrested on a Friday morning, chosen deliberately so the matter was secured before anyone with motivation to interfere could locate a judge willing to be reached over a weekend. Edmund came to find her in the library where she had been pretending to read. "It's done," he said. She had imagined this moment many times, had constructed it as a culmination, a triumph, the cold satisfaction of an equation finally solved. What she felt instead was much quieter and much more complicated. "My father's name," she said, "will be formally cleared. The fraud was Whitmore's construction. The evidence confirms it without ambiguity. Your father's reputation will be restored publicly and the original judgment vacated." He paused. "It will be in the papers." She absorbed this. 3 years. 2 years of planning and 6 weeks of living inside the answer and 11 days of building something solid enough to stand. And it was done. "Are you all right?" Edmund asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. He came all the way into the library and sat across. From her, not beside her, not crowding the moment, just present. And she let herself feel all of it without managing any of it, which was something she hadn't done in a very long time. After a while, she said, "He would have liked you. My father. He'd have found you extremely frustrating for about 3 weeks and then decided you were the most interesting person he'd encountered." "Would he?" Edmund said. "He believed good legal architecture was a form of justice in itself, that if you built the argument correctly, the truth didn't need to perform. It just needed to be visible." She looked at the papers. "He'd have called this visible." Edmund looked at the papers too. Then he looked at her. And for the first time she saw his face entirely open, unmanaged, the way she suspected almost no one had ever been allowed to see him. "Elizabeth," he said, "I chose a woman in a hall because she was the only person in the building who wasn't performing for me." He paused. "It turns out she was performing harder than anyone there. And I find, having now met the woman underneath, the real one, with the ink and the files and the 2 years of meticulous grief-driven work, that I would like to choose her too." He paused. "If she'll allow it." She looked up at him. "She would very much allow it," Elizabeth said quietly. He kissed her in the library between 2 centuries of books, in the ordinary morning light of a Friday that London would never know had changed anything. It was careful and deliberate and entirely itself, like everything about him, and she felt it in the specific place behind her sternum where she had been keeping everything managed and controlled for 2 years, and something there came loose in a way she did not try to stop. When he pulled back, she kept her eyes closed for one extra second. "Your plan," he said quietly, "was meticulous." It was. It failed completely. Catastrophically, she agreed. Fortunate that. Create Dart opened her eyes. Outside, London went on, enormous and indifferent, entirely unaware that somewhere in a Mayfair library, two people who had found each other through grief and strategy and a single unanswered letter had quietly, improbably, built something that would last.